I'm Colton,
And I'm Kalen.
and this is the Future of Thought. Democracy. Is it the greatest form of government?
That is the question that we will be dissecting today. And it is one that some of you might think has a really quick and easy answer. But there's actually a lot of statistics surrounding this question. And also, I think me and Colton have our own particular viewpoints on the role democracy plays on the world stage beyond America, if people prefer it. So the question, is it the best form of governance, really can only be answered if people who live in democracies, in my opinion, can substantiate that, who also have experience in other types of governments, like communism. But I think people like that are few and far between.
And just to set the groundworks, I can't imagine anyone listening doesn't know what democracy means, but just so we're all on the same page of what exactly Kalen and I are talking about whenever we mention democracy or democratic rule or things like that. Democracy is really just a system of government in which everyone in the population is able to be represented to the state. You're able to vote, you participate in the state, you are a member of the state. And that's really the definition that Caleb and I will be using if we mention democracy in any form in this. Sorry to cut you off, Caitlin, if I did.
Yeah, no, you're good. It's good to clear things up. So I want to say that I guess I'm going to preface everything I say here with my opinion before I get into any research that actually substantiates some sort of final answer that might come out of this discussion. But at a fundamental level, democracy is something that seems preferred. I mean, I would most definitely prefer it because with democracy comes the idea of choice. Whether or not that's an illusion is an entirely different discussion depending on where you're from. But democracy is definitely democracy versus other forms of government, whether it be authoritarian regime or a oligarchy. It's definitely interesting because when I look at a democratically run state, if it's truly a democracy, I think it's easily preferable because whether or not you like currently what's happening or you want change, democracy gives you the ability to have an impact. So I mean, that's my quick and easy personal answer. Do you have one, Colton? Let's hear what you got.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You can think about Fukuyama's The End of History, a pretty well-known writing. And it's fascinating because in that, Fukuyama proposes that we are reaching what you might call the end. Well, he calls it the end of history, obviously, but the end game for civilization. And the proposition is that democracy is the end goal, right? We reach a point where in every nation over time, every state throughout the world or throughout the planets, if we expand further, you have the ability for every individual to represent themselves. And since everyone is representing themselves, majority rules, therefore the most people are prospering or at least happy, right?
Yep.
But it's interesting because there are lots of arguments that can be made and have been made and will continue to be made that a single ruler, let's say, whether it's an authoritarian state or a king, an older term, in some places, still relevant in a little bit in some others. Nonetheless, there's less red tape, right? So you talk about Donald Trump wanting to drain the swamp. He wants to get rid of the bureaucracy and the extra workers of the federal government. I believe he actually did remove something like half of the federal bureaucracy without refilling the positions. Of course, part of that, unfortunately, was this, I forget the name of the council that works on virus prevention. Obviously, that was an unfortunate timing considering the COVID-19 pandemic we're in right now. But nonetheless, he was doing that. And in some ways, if you like the ruler, you like the leader, you like the dictator, whatever situation you're in, and you support their opinions and the general public supports them, there is a much easier path forward to instantiating these improvements to society. It could be something that
Mm.
is as simple as a 1% higher tax. It could be social welfare programs. It could be increased military spending. These are all things that are somewhat contentious today, at least in the US, and I'm sure elsewhere, that with a single ruler system, let's say, if they were maybe not omnibenevolent, but they were well intentioned, they could get a lot of good done. But of course, history has showed us that whenever you have great power, the great responsibility doesn't necessarily follow.
Hmm.
And power and money can go to your head. But there certainly are good arguments to be made for individual rule and for the benefit it could bring to society.
Right. Yeah. You're definitely with some authoritarian and uh, other types of regimes. You definitely, if they're run correctly, you get a huge boost in efficacy. Um, your output and the things that you can change in a short amount of time probably goes through the roof. If you're a regime that is widely supported. Whereas in a democracy, I'm sure if you survey any average American right now, they'll probably say that our country is disabled in some way or another because it can't get things done. But I think that's a byproduct of um, at least somewhat working democracy is kind of this slowing down of progress when it comes to things like law and and uh, and things at a higher level. That are run at the institution level. Um, One thing that I quickly skimmed, I didn't read all the way, but it was this study by a publisher called Asian Barometer that talked about um, surveying 46 countries. I don't remember exactly all of the 46, but a majority of them were Asian countries, surveying the people and asking them. Um, I don't exactly know how the questions were cited precisely, but basically, if they prefer democracy and what they thought about a democratically run state. And the correlation they found in their studies was that people who typically didn't really understand what democracy was preferred it less, and people who knew what democracy was preferred it more. And so, obviously, in Western nations like America, Canada, Germany, you're going to get people that typically prefer democracy, which makes sense because not only do they live in that type of system, but they're aware of how it works. Um, and so, an interesting that could be argued, although I don't know it because I don't live in China, uh, I don't live in Russia, but perhaps an issue with people continuing to support regimes that may not be in the best interest of the people um, is that they're just ignorant. And that's not to be an insult. That's just to say that they're completely unaware of the situation and how powerless they truly are in the government that they're a part of.
Right. And I think you hit a really important point there. Ignorance is the foundational problem, you might say, for so many facets of society that are not beneficial to a lot of people. So, those situations where you have individuals voting for a politician based on a party, but maybe that individual is actually voting on someone who doesn't have policy, doesn't propose policy in their best interest, right? Or you have individuals like we're talking about who they don't know that democracy exists, or maybe other forms of government they might prefer. So they like a meritocracy, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So they can't be in favor of it if they don't know it exists, right? Or they believe they don't have any power to make it, to influence change, to implement it, right? The same thing happens with extreme cults. This is a really common situation where in any facet of your life that could be improved, almost as a requisite is ignorance of the topic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a really
Yeah.
important point that even before we progress and talking about the validity of democracy or if it's preferred or if it's not, you can't even have the option if you don't have the awareness.
Right. Moving forward, another thing I want to share about my understanding of nations that have differently run institutions like China and Russia, um, which I don't know all too much about, to be completely honest. I mean, I do know that the the head leaders of both nations are consolidating power for themselves, what with the life terms and dissolving certain parts of the government that may hinder their progress and staying in office. Um, the way I view it, it seems like a game where you have to. It's a game of how you can best convince and manipulate the populace that you're controlling, that your regime uh, is doing good for the people. If it's not a democracy, and the other thing that could be talked about here is fear. I mean, I don't know how effective fear mongering is in keeping a populace tame. I imagine maybe for the short term, but not very effective long term.
I will interject one exception at least. North Korea, from the surface, seems to be in check. Obviously, there is immense poverty in the countryside.
Mm-hmm.
Their city centers are not exactly as they promote them to be. But in terms of not even self-sustaining, but because of their dependency on China, they receive enough imports to on the surface be able to present themselves as a functioning country. And in a lot of ways, they are functioning, just not for the majority, obviously, but they are functioning in the sense that they aren't deteriorating quickly, right?
Right.
If that makes any sense. So that's kind of a counterexample. But again, the future of North Korea, I suspect, is
Yeah,
dim.
it's not looking very bright for them. Yeah. On the topic of these different types of regimes, um, one thing that I've noticed thinking about this topic of democracy over other types of governments is culture, because the social interactions and etiquette of people and what they believe should be required in a government, I'm sure is probably the one most important thing when a people determining how a specific group of people answer the question, is democracy better? I imagine if you ask some villages in China the question, if they knew what it was, they might even say they would prefer communism or their current authoritarian leader, uh, just due to the fact that they've been led to believe that it's just merely more effective and that they want what's best for everyone in China. I wouldn't know. Obviously, I've never been to mainland inland China, and that probably won't happen for a while, if at all. But if any of you are from mainland inland China, you know, you could share that with us. That'd be great. What you thought?
And there are religious implications potentially as well. If you are a strong supporter of Sharia law, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm not arguing for or against it in this discussion, but if you support Sharia law, that obviously is a theocratic state rule, right? There's no secularism, there's no separation of state. And so in that instance, then you would prefer to be ruled by the religious leaders of your religion or of your nation state. And that would be better to you, maybe not because of your own individual liberties, but because of your ability to, worship a God and do what's right because of your holy book, right? So there's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of implications here that aren't necessarily simply economic, this is what I want, or social norms, social structures, this is what's best for society. There are so many layers to this that affect different substrates of society too.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely a hard topic to approach. I'm trying to think here, because when we look at the question of, is democracy, really the best way of governing a state or a country, would we be considering how effective it is, or like what would you think be the criteria for determining like what would put democracy above other things? I guess we should maybe settle that.
That brings up a really good question because, frankly, I'm not sure there's an exact answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
It could be a value proposition of what promotes the most human well-being or the well-being of conscious creatures, if you believe that mammals have a level of consciousness, for example. So
Hmm.
whatever promotes well-being, that
Okay.
could be the goal of democracy. It could simply be, from a realist perspective, economic growth, right? It's something that I don't think we have the, not to get too deep, but I don't think we have the morals of society settled in a sense. And what I mean by that is there's still, I mean, we're still young species in a lot of ways. We only industrialized, a few centuries ago.
Hmm.
And because of that, our technology is making us appear so advanced, but our intelligence is
Yeah.
only going so far. It's only changing so quickly.
Yeah.
And we haven't quite settled a lot of really important prerequisite discussions, right? For example, what what is morality, right? Is it
Hmm.
simply objective truth based on a leader? Is it subjective based on
Right.
rational
Right.
thought? Is it a third option that's less talked about, objective based on well-being and morality, or well-being and pain scales, for example, like how little or how much pain individuals are feeling collectively. There's once we have these major discussions and we have at least semblances of answers approaching, I think only then can we compare these different domains, because if we don't have these domains understood very well, if we haven't placed a value on economics compared to human life, then it makes situations of democracy or pandemics, when can you reopen
Hmm.
the economy versus, when should you maintain human life? It makes these situations really difficult. And I think we're just such a young species that it's challenging for us to really have an absolute answer. So, I mean, I think there might be a number of possible absolute answers out there, but I have no way of telling you what that is.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, it comes back to society and culture. I mean, I think that's definitely the closest thing we could get to like an answer. It would be coming down to, how can we come together as a culture or a society, unify, and really figure out the answer to which of these is better. Because I do think there is a solid answer. I think it's difficult to approach this situation relatively and excuse authoritarian regimes, regardless of what they do. I mean, they could do good, but at the end of the day, so little power is in the public that if something bad were to happen, right, it's no longer up to the whims of the public what that thing is. It's up to the whims of the leader and their small clique of power that they can control. Um, so it's interesting for sure.
Let me ask you then, because we've both done our own separate research for this podcast. For those who don't know, Kaylin and I do our own separate research, and then we have our own pages on documents where we take notes from our research and what have you.
Hmm.
And we don't often look at the other person's research. But based on some of my research, and maybe you read this site as well, Kaylin, it came up pretty quickly in search results, was the democracy index that I found online.
Hmm.
And for example, the United States was actually downgraded from a full democracy to a flawed democracy in 2016. And it's really interesting because the United States, at least by the citizens internally, as far as I can tell, are very patriotic and see the US as this economic free state uh, and a democratic safe haven for a lot of
Hmm.
people.
Hmm.
But it's fascinating because we're something like, I think it was 26th or 25th. It was 25th is what it was.
Yeah, I have it
On
pulled up here. Yeah, 25th.
Okay, great. So you found that as well. Really, my point of bringing that up is I wonder, Kalen, is it justified to compare the world to the United States as this democratic haven for you know uh, individual rights and liberties and our equal representation when you have elections that have scandals, as we saw in with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica and potentially Russia, but I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of that because I'm too uneducated.
Hmm.
You have potential scandals. You have an electoral college, which is a really interesting situation because that makes some individuals feel like their votes aren't as important. And I'm just wondering, I mean, what do you think about comparing the world to the United States as so many American citizens do?
Okay, so my viewpoint on America as like a democratic country. uh, When I was being taught in high school, I used to look at the United States as kind of a beacon of liberty in a world that is evolving to match the standards that United States has set. Right now, whether or not that was just my education alone, or many other people's as well, I'm not sure. But obviously, as I've entered college and I'm now 1 year in and doing my own research, um, it's quite clear that in my opinion, some countries have adopted what we've tried to foster here now, and have taken it to the next level. Looking at the same index you mentioned, I don't know how substantiated this index is, but I'm sure there's a bunch of research put behind it. But Scandinavian countries, Norway, Iceland, Sweden, they are extremely high on this index, and I'm sure for good reason. Now, I have minimal knowledge on these countries, but I think one thing that separates these countries that are higher on the list, in my honest opinion, than from America, is that these countries have a better sense of collective efficacy and civil society. Like they are very strongly knitted together people. As far as I see, as an outsider looking at them, as an American looking at these people, that's kind of how I view it. And I'm not exactly 100% on how they feel about each other and their government, but as it's talked about, and it's very rarely here, but as it's talked about in the news and some articles, those Scandinavian countries I mentioned they're extremely adept at what they're pulling off with their governments and their people. And it seems like the populace is, for the majority, happy. And it's truly impressive because in recent years, like you mentioned, with the scandals and the just lack of transparency sometimes with the government, um, people are really, I don't know, I feel like it's hard to set the United States to the same standards of these countries. Um, in my opinion, it's also due to the fact that our media and our news control such a huge market and such a huge audience that they can easily manipulate the viewpoint on America. I have a pretty poor. I'm not going to say poor. Poor is kind of low, setting the United States to low standards. I'm going to say I have below average viewpoints on the United States right now. And it's probably because of these news and media outlets that continue to cover things and say things that typically promote negative attitude towards the government. Now, is that a good thing? I couldn't tell you. I don't know how much to trust here and who to trust. And I think that's part of the issue. It's kind of hard to figure out, what exactly should I be listening to in America? And I don't know what it's like elsewhere because I've never been outside of the United States, unfortunately.
I think you bring up really two good points there. Uh, in reverse order, news is a really fascinating piece of the United States politics, really. I know they're not
Yeah.
inherently political, they're just inherently sources of information. And obviously, politics, the governing involves a lot of information spread, but that information has no standard, right?
Right.
There's no badge of honor that says in the corner of your TV screen or your social media page, this news site has been verified that 95 or higher percent of what they say is true. That little
Mm-hmm.
badge doesn't exist, right? So it's an interesting game of feeding the identities, feeding the viewpoints of those who are so individualistic in the US, which was your first point, my second point, that you have so many individualized people who may or may not be in favor of a social democracy or let alone a democratic socialism because they want their independence, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
and I also understand those opinions and sometimes agree with them. So we have this very large group of around 330 million people who
Hmm.
are often very independent. And then you, over time, develop news medias that instead of being verified by any independent source, because I don't know how that would even work, but instead of having any kind of verification, they simply spread the information to groups that form in the nation, right? So, of course, there's obvious examples of this. People on the right would say their favorite is Fox News. People on the left,
Hmm.
MSNBC, CNN, and these are just generalizations, but there's a lot of truth to it. So it's a really difficult proposition now. It's a really difficult proposition now to understand and try to propose a way forward, right? To try to find this, to refind, if you think we had it at one time, this state of true democracy, if that's what we're in favor of, right?
Hmm.
Because we are, if this democracy index means anything, clearly falling. And as a country that, as far as I could tell from my education and from yours, claim to be this stronghold of human rights and democracy and Western thought, as it might be said, we have to find a way to re regain that
Yeah.
information and retain what we have, right? I don't know. I'm hoping I'm not saying anything that doesn't make a lot of sense, but does that kind of hit home with you too, Kalen?
Yeah, I would love to see America climb ranks on this. I mean, obviously, I'm from the United States, and see my own country that's supposed to be at the the pinnacle of freedom be uh, pretty far down there is kind of disheartening. But I mean, at the same time, I think the biggest hard hitting issue is just the fact that an overwhelming feeling of uneasiness and distrust has grown from. I'm going to give one example. This is not exclusive to our president Donald Trump, but he himself, whether or not you consider it funny or provocative or whatever, the truth is when he stands up there and he calls things fake news and he defaces all of these things, whether because of trying to publicize himself as a certain personality or whatever the hell else he's trying to do. I mean, it really just hurts the transparency because you now look at that media source and you're like, well, I've trusted that for 10 years and our own president's calling it garbage. Like, what? What's happening here? And then, I think it's predominantly a culture thing, in my opinion. I think it's just we're such a mosh pit of different peoples, and with a current administration that's all over the place, especially with the pandemic too, and during the election season for 2016, it was just a complete mess as well. I mean, I don't blame people for lacking the trust that they want to have for the government. Um, do I see a way back up? I mean, my like fairy tale solution might be to somehow bring people together. And I don't like the idea of controlling outlets and media and news, but I kind of like the idea of your like certified little ribbon on the bottom of the screen that says this source isn't full of biases. Giving the people the choice and allowing the market to saturate naturally, where people hopefully, I mean, I would hope people herd to the news source that is more uh, factually based, and obviously you'd have to have very strict and very very intelligently run criteria for that news source in order for it to be honestly and truthfully, uh, what it says it is, which is fact based. But if we could have a trend towards that, I think that would create a huge implosion. And also, I think it begins with education too. I think the education system plays a huge role in determining, what comes out of people when they're now adults and they have to face all these, big hitters like politics and world news and all sorts of things that just start flooding your head as soon as you're out of high school and you're like, wait, I'm an adult now. It's kind of crazy. I think fixing up the education system in some ways could also help us kick back up the list, if that's the goal here.
Before we continue, we'd like to make a quick announcement. We run this podcast ad-free. Of course, with the trial version of Spotify, for example, some ads are simply out of our control. However, we will never run third-party ads during the Future of Thought podcast. This podcast acts to provide accessible, unhindered discourse for all who listen. Because of this, we rely on you, the listener, to support this podcast. Support us by visiting our Patreon at patreon.com/The Future of Thought and selecting the tier of your choice. Regardless of how much or how little you choose to donate, you are a greatly appreciated listener. Now let's get back to the podcast. I think everything you said is exactly right. And to expand on it even further, I wouldn't be surprised if the political game of re-election in the United States, I wouldn't be surprised if that didn't play a major role in the problems we have today, right? So when you near re-election season, let's look at the presidency right now. For those of you listening at the time of this release or shortly after, we have the midst of a pandemic. You're trying to reopen an economy.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, I think it was just yesterday, I was actually showing Kaylin this clip. You have Donald Trump giving a press conference. And during the press conference, you have a bunch of truckers on the nearby street honking their horns on full blast, just holding them down. And you can hear almost nothing during the speech. It's something of an auditory protest, right? And then, of course, during this, I wouldn't call it mayhem, that's a stretch, but during this experience, you have Donald Trump at his microphone, speaking nice and loud right into the mic, saying, "I support these people." And I'm like, okay, that sounds good. And then he keeps talking. He says, "I support these people because they are protesting exactly how much they like me." And you're trying to process what that means. And he's like, "These are people who love me," or something to that extent. I hope I didn't mischaracterize that at all, Kaylin.
No, yeah, you pretty much got it you got it right on the. You got it. Yeah, it's it's pretty ridiculous.
Right. It's not just to call Donald Trump out. I mean, any person in politics is trying to play this game of re-election, right? The whole goal is if you want to be in power and you want to influence whether it's your community locally or at large, you need to remain in power in a lot of ways. It's almost incentivizing that. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but there is a huge, huge game right now of if you have money, if you're good at marketing yourself, you can at least get on the docket and get a large number of votes, right? That's something that can happen, and it's just a fascinating game because you have the rally around the flag effect whenever a president, isn't doing super hot, and then they either claim someone had a terrorist attack or they bombed someone, and then it looks like we're in a war state, and then in a war state, everyone rallies around their leader, right? Bill Clinton did something similar. It's common throughout history, and now you have Trump saying he's a wartime president, and in a lot of ways, he might be intrinsically a wartime president in some ways, although admittedly some of this death and warfare could have been prevented, but that's a discussion we've already had on this podcast. But nonetheless, it's just a fascinating game of here's what's true, but I'm going to say it in a way that maybe isn't true, but it makes me look good so I can get reelected and continuing my power. And I think this dynamic, this structure, although it enables a democracy, it is a democracy really, because people are selecting those who they support. They're not selecting you to continually running a campaign. They don't want you to get elected in 2016, have 4 years in office, but after 2, you start campaigning for the next election. They elect you because they think your opinions are the best of all the options. Whether or not it was a fair election based on how much money you had, that's a different discussion. But they, regardless, voted for you because they think you're the best candidate who is going to do the most for this country or at least do the least harm for this country. And they expect that you use your term to do just as such, right? And so it's a really interesting dynamic where I think combined with the education you talked about and a couple other things that you mentioned, this game of politics, once people are in power, only perpetuates this problem.
Yeah. Here, I'll give you an interesting perspective since, and this might be biased for engineers and against politicians, but at the end of the day, anyone could be a good person. But um, as an engineer, you're taught that your job is to save lives. Basically, you're going to design this thing so a human can live safely, comfortably, and for as long as possible inside of something. A politician a politician tries to get reelected regardless of how many people get hurt, who or when or what or why. I mean, at the end of the day, if they don't get reelected, they don't have a job. And so, whether they have good intent or bad, the game of politics is one of reelection. And when I compare it to engineering, it's interesting because engineers are punished for doing bad. Politicians really are promoted. Politicians strive off an environment where they merely get reelected. And so whether or not that's being truthful or honest, who knows? Because not everyone gets to see the effects of what someone does while they're in office, especially since many things are long term. And so one politician can lie for 8 years, get reelected, get paid, and get away with it. I just think you're right because with it being very hurtful to the system, because now they're playing the game of how long can I stay in office, not what good can I do for the people, regardless of what good intents they had coming into the job. So,
And that is exactly the danger of biased media. Because you take individuals, as you alluded to just now, who vote for someone often based on emotion as well as logical information, and then you sit them down in a region where everyone kind of thinks the same. So everyone watches Fox News or CNN or MSNBC or whoever. It doesn't really matter for the sake of this argument,
mhm,
but they sit down and they watch this like everyone else in their community or everyone else in their family, and then they're only told the story from this perspective.
mhm,
So it's not that it's a good idea to just disagree with everyone on the sake of their misguided emotions, because everyone has misguided emotions if all you do is listen to a mainstream media source.
mhm,
Everyone. But if we can understand where the failing is in what information is being told, where your education is lacking from the news media as well as through standard education systems, but for the sake of this discussion, through the media, then we can at least empathize with people because their conclusions are only formed just like everyone else in the world. Your conclusion is only formed based on the information in front of you. Now,
mhm,
some people are more proactive and they do their best to find different sources. Some people don't because it makes them uncomfortable, and some people don't because they just don't know any better,
mhm,
right? And that's not their fault. I don't know of a news source that I don't know of. I mean, it sounds obnoxious even saying it like that, right? You can't research something that you don't know exists. So, really, I think media and education are a huge issue because if you don't know what other sources exist, what other options there are, and you are presented facts that are misguided and are misleading and don't give you the full context, whether that means Democratic or Republican or anywhere else, then you are only going to have your opinion shaped on these set of ostensibly true facts.
mhm.
And that's all you have to go off of, right? So at the foundational level, there's just a lot of issues that need to be fixed for the higher level of systematic democratic rule to even be functional, right? And I suspect that's part of why our ranking is going down in the world list.
Right. So when we have the discussion, is democracy preferable? I think that when people are asked the question, they're going to say yes, but you truly have to know what a democracy is to really know the answer to that. Um, I don't know anyone who's had experience in authoritarian regime. I don't know anyone who's lived in China, who's lived in a communistic state, and I don't know anyone who can tell me that they've experienced that and could legitimately tell me it's better because at the end of the day, I think the best we can discuss about this situation is only how to improve democracy so it is the best of what it can be. Because when I sit here and I try to compare it to other places, it's just hard because I don't know anyone who sits there and openly says that, yeah, I'd love to be ruled by a king and be unfairly treated. And it really comes down to fairness, I think, at a fundamental level, when people are given the choice between democracy and other rules of government. But is it better? I think the trend is yes. I think the trend is towards yes. Do I think the whole world will trend towards democracy? Hopefully without bloodshed and warfare, yes. But you never know with the human race. Yeah.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder too, from an international perspective, what is the ultimate end game, right? As I mentioned early on in this podcast, Fukuyama would say it's simply democracy, democratic rule everywhere. That's the end of our socio-cultural evolution, as it
Mm-hmm.
were. I think something maybe like a Kantian tripod, right? The three pieces of the tripod being domestic democratic institutions, right? Democracy, but expanding further into saying that the second leg is international institutions, right? That hold countries accountable to one another.
Yeah.
And then the third leg being international economic interdependence, right? If we have a dependency on each other, we can rely on each other, not completely dependent, but an interdependence where we all
Right.
pull a weight and we all are held accountable through international institutions and we all have democracies, maybe not intrinsically because they're superior to a meritocracy or something like that, but because it's at least the same. If it's the same mentality globally, then through these international cooperation, we can have a world of peace and a world of understanding where we can begin to empathize with one another. We can begin to have civil conversation, and
Uh-huh.
hopefully through that process, which is one I think makes a lot of sense to me,
Mm.
although I'm not an expert on international relations. But through that process, you could then start fixing problems domestically, right? If you have accountability on a world stage where all of the best minds come together and try to do what's best for the world, it's not going to be a bad thing, right? At absolute worst, nothing changes all that much. But at best, it is the best thing that's ever happened to society, right? So I mean, it sounds like we're both in favor of democracy, but of course, anyone listening, we always promote that you do your own research and you form your own opinions because we are not experts. We're not economists. As Kalen said, he's going into engineering. Um, so, like, we're not the know all be all of these individual topics.
Right.
Trying to start the discussion. So, be sure to do your own research as
Oh.
well.
Yeah, sorry if you heard a little bing there. My mouse died. Would edit that out, but unfortunately you were saying something pretty important. Hey, that's okay.
Don't worry.
That's okay. You're saying the hit home. That was the takeaway. Yeah. Whatever you have to share, we are all ears. I mean, hopefully I'm planning on expanding my mindset by traveling around the world these next few years during college. I really need a breath of fresh air because I've really only gotten one perspective my whole life, and it's here in America. And to be able to know what it's like, I mean, even if I could visit mainland China and feel completely safe, I would. But I'd have to work out the logistics of that, and if that truly is a smart idea, which it probably isn't, especially not during a pandemic, but in the future. But I would hope that in the future that we can put aside cultural and governmental differences, and like you said, form some sort of national coalition of all the countries of the world coming together to cooperate. We already have institutions that try to perform similar tasks, but obviously their efficacy is debated, and not every country follows their advisings. Yeah, it's such a wicked problem for sure. The debate between democracy and other forms of government, which is better. I think deep down we all know the moral and ethical answer is the one that gives people the freedom to choose for themselves what's the best. Because in an authoritarian regime, you don't even have the choice of if you like democracy. Whereas democracy, you could say all day that you like authoritarianism and then go move to an authoritarian state, and then perhaps be stuck there, unfortunately, and then learn your lesson if it's not as good as you expected. I wouldn't know at the end of the day, but yeah, I mean, you got any thoughts to wrap this up, Colton?
Frankly, all I can say is what I had just mentioned as your mouse was dying. It sounds like it really. We have our opinions. We both are obviously in favor of democracy. We both think it is superior, at least to a lot of other political systems. But at the same time, we're not experts, and we only have, as Kaylin alluded to, one perspective, or at least one direction, right? One direction that our perspective has been formed. We've never lived in an authoritarian state. We've never lived in a theocracy. That's never happened. So frankly, if you have, let us know. I don't know how likely it is that this podcast will get to someone who has, but if you
Yeah.
experience that, I mean, we'd love to hear it. Or if you know someone who has, right? And as I said, do your own research. If you like what we say, awesome. But don't just agree with us because we said it.
Yeah, yeah, you'll
So
find me and Colton agreeing with each other on like 87% of things. That's
exactly.
okay. Just because we're bouncing the same idea back and forth doesn't mean it's the truth. Doesn't mean you have to agree with it. In fact, you might have been sitting there saying, "Oh my God, can these two shut up about this? It's wrong." But
Okay, you have every right to
yeah.
believe that, at least in the United States, with the rights and liberties we have, with our democracy. You
Hmm.
know what? That's okay. And we support those ideals, and be sure to do your research and come to your own conclusions.
Yeah.